Hello everybody, this is Maurice Fourie from GreenPro Consulting. And today I want to make a video to explain why it is so expensive to register a SSEG with Eskom and what conditions is it that makes it so expensive and why in some cases it won't be so expensive and in other cases it will be expensive. Okay. Before we actually go into why it's so expensive, there are two things we have to cover. The first one is, why do we have to register a system with Eskom? And then the second item that I want to talk about is who completes the compliance test report and then submit that with the application to Eskom to register the system. So let's just talk about those two topics first of all. We have to register with Eskom because the law says we must. And the relevant act is Act number 4 of 2006. And there is, 3 or 4 amendments to that act. And one of the important amendments to take note of was published on 12th August 2021 in Government Gazette 44989 and it's titled Licensing Exemption and Registration Notice. And essentially that says if your system is less than a megawatt, then you don't need a generation license, but you have to register the system. So that is where the requirement comes from. Now that requirement is on NERSA, but NERSA doesn't have end user information. So they don't know to come to your house and make sure that you are registered. So what they do is NERSA has distributors, and their distributors are Eskom and the municipalities. So they've placed the responsibility for doing the registration on Eskom and on the municipalities. So stop shouting at Eskom. They were told by NERSA that they must do these registrations. And NERSA is doing it because that is what the law says. It is as simple as that. Okay, so let's look at who has to complete the compliance test report. Now, the only document that I'm aware of that specifies the information that needs to be provided when you do a system registration was issued by Eskom, and it has a unique identifier, and there you can see the number there, and it is now in revision 8. And it states that there are 2 people who have to provide technical input to do a sign-off. And this is where the cost is actually incurred, is when you involve an electrician and an engineer, and they have to make changes to the system to make it comply. So in the beginning of this compliance test report, there's like 7 notes, and note number 5 is applicable in this case. And it says a copy of the COC must be submitted as an annexure to this report. And what it will include is everything from the point of supply. In other words, your DB box next to the street. From that point, all the electrical AC circuitry up to the inverter. That is included in the COC. And then when you come out of the inverter, all the electrical circuitry that goes from there to the point of use in your house. In other words, plugs, lights, stove, geyser, you name it. So everything that is AC in your house that is not directly associated with the small-scale embedded generation or the SSEG, that has to be signed off by an electrician, and he signs it off using a bog standard COC as specified in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Okay. Then the embedded generation installation must be certified to comply with all the prescriptions. Now, by the embedded generation system, we are talking about, if there is a generator, it includes that. We're talking about the solar panels, the inverter itself with its certifications and its functionality and all sorts of things like that. And then there is, of course, the battery system. So it's essentially those 3 or 4 components. Everything that connects them together, the protection equipment and the safety standards associated with that system, that is part of the embedded generator, and that is what the engineer has to sign off. So essentially, to summarize, an electrician has to sign off the AC components, and the rest of the SSEG has to be signed off by an engineer. Right. So let's look at why, now that we've covered those 2 points, why does estimates of cost vary so much? And I'm going to look at an estimate for a COC issued by what I consider to be a good electrician. As I said, this is an extreme example. It is for an upmarket house. The house has a double story, it's 3-phase, it has every bell and whistle. In other words, it's got a huge number of air conditioners and all sorts of fancy equipment that you wouldn't find in a normal house. So yes, it is quite an involved electrical system, and the electrical system is a mess. Okay, and interesting enough, this house does not have a SSEG. The reason why there is a COC required is because the house was being sold at the time that the quote was done, and yeah, so now they need a COC for the transfer. Now, the owner can accept that quote, and I don't know if he did. Or he can say, and that happens in a lot of cases, I'm going to get a lacatrician. Now, that is a term that Harold's coined, which is somebody that will give you a COC for cheap. But when he walks away, I bet the bottom dollar that the system is not actually compliant. He just does the absolute minimum and issues a COC for 2,000-3,000, whatever the case might be. And a lot of people take that action. There's some horrendous stories if I talk to electricians about COCs that is not actually be COCs. They're either being issued fraudulently or they are being issued by reckless electricians. Mostly not reckless electricians, mostly guys who are not. Like a guy said to me this morning, he spoke to an electrician who did work for him, and the guy says, yeah, but his brother is an electrician and his brother trusts him to sign it off. It's those sort of guys that gives you a COC for next to nothing. Right, so in this case, the estimate to do the COC is 46, it's actually closer to 47,000. So there you're already in for 47,000, but it's not to register the system, it's to fix the sins of the past, to fix all the electrical issues in the house. And this is just so that you can see what the quote is all about. You have to really see this, I suppose, to understand what it is. When I spoke to a guy, and he issued this quite a long time ago, he said the house is just a total mess. If you if you open the DB, it looks like a dog's breakfast. The cabling or the wiring that's been using, the house wire, is totally undersized. So in a lot of cases, he has to take the circuits and pull them out and draw in properly sized cabling or house wire and things like that. So yes, it is a mess. There's the second page of the quote for the COC. And then you can see there the bottom line is 47,000. Right. So that is then 46,000 which you have to pay to get a COC. Now, if an engineer is involved in the design of the COC, of the SSEG right from the beginning, then he will make sure that the system that is being installed is designed according to regulations, so that there don't have to be rework by the time that you actually want to register this SSEG. Secondly, he will make sure that the correct documentation does exist, and that everything that needs to go with the documentation of the system, like the NRS 097-2-1 certificate for the inverter and things like that, is the correct one, and that he does actually have a copy of it, and he copies that into the application and things like that. So if the engineer is involved from the beginning, then that cost isn't that high. But if it's an existing SSEG, which was done by a fly-by-night installer, then there will normally be no documentation. None of these certificates that are required will actually be in place, and you'll find that a lot of the protection equipment and the connections between, remember we're talking about DC, talking about very high voltages in the case of the solar, and you're talking about very high currents in the case of the battery system. So we're talking about like 4 or 5 times the highest current that you have in a house. And in terms of the solar system, you could be talking about 2 or 3 times the voltage that you normally have in your house. So these are all extreme conditions that the engineer has to sign off, and that's why they want an engineer to sign it off. It's very far outside the scope of a normal electrical system. So in summary then, if you look at, say the electrician is going to cost you 47,000, and I must keep on mentioning this is an extreme example. The engineer might cost you another 20,000. So now it can cost you 70,000 to register a system. It's not to register the system, it is to fix the mess that is currently making up the electrical installation in, let's say it's a house. If it's a factory or something, it could be a hell of a lot more. And all the shortcuts that were taken when these systems was installed, that is where the money comes in. If everything is okay in an upmarket, 3-phase, double-story, fancy house, it's going to cost you about 10,000. But if it's a mess like this, it's going to cost you 70,000. So the cost depends on what has to be fixed. And this is where the chicken comes home to roost, of all the cheapies that you used in your house in the past. Then just one final note, the engineer's cost. The engineer has to sign off the overall system. And you can't just call him and say, listen, we've done the whole thing. We promise you everything is fine, so will you please just sign for us? The sign-off statement that is part of the inspection report that the engineer has to sign specifically says, I have inspected the installation. I have examined the associated design and documentation, and I have personally on-site witnessed the relevant test. So the engineer has to be on-site, he has to check it himself, he can't take somebody else's word for it, and he has to be on-site and witness the relevant test that needs to be done. And then he says, I confirm that the information given above is correct and complied with grid codes, which is, it's all the grid codes that need, and some of them are not South African, especially when you get to solar. They are European and international standards. Then, of course, there's NRS, which is mostly NRS 097-2-1. There's SANS standards, which is SANS 10142. I think the latest version is like 3 months old. And you actually need idiots like me who actually read these standards when a new one come out. I think most people have never read a standard in their life. And then all the applicable statutory requirements. There could be other things. There could be even structural requirements that come into play. And then he simply has to identify himself. He has to specify that he is registered with the Engineering Council of South Africa in a professional category. In other words, he's registered as a PR Eng or a PR Tech with the Engineering Council of South Africa. And then basically he just sort of has to give his name and blah, blah, blah. And he has to say that he is competent. In other words, he has experience in renewable energy systems. And then he signs that off. So there's no shortcut. The engineer must do the inspection personally. So this notion of please just sign for us doesn't work. So thank you very much. It's Marius Fourie. I'm from GreenPro Consulting. And yeah, I hope it clarifies a bit why the cost can be fairly reasonable or the cost can be extremely high.